How's it going, everybody? I had a quick idea to do something just in case you were wondering. This you may or may or not, but have you ever? I noticed that some of the people that watch my channel have been getting Allen and Heath consoles, or people that have Allen and Heath consoles, or just a mixing console in general. Have you ever wondered how the signal flows in the console, like which route directions that it go? Well, this is I'm gonna try to do a breakdown of the signal path and how the board routes based on knobs and switches and how you send it. Now, naturally, on this console, you can see this one's a 48 channel, so there's 48 inputs, and then there's basically 3 ways you can route outputs. So each channel has a direct out from the channel itself, or everything's going to route through your main 2 faders here, or this monitor fader here, which I use as a sub, or it can route through the buses, which will then route out. You can send the routes out from the buses separately, or you can route from the channels through a bus into the main outputs, and then it will come out. Or you got matrices that it can be routed out that way. So there's several outputs, but the output section is how you're going to hear everything and send everything out of the console. So basically, let's talk about the routing right quick. Naturally, whenever something's plugged into the input, it's going to come into a console. Anytime you have a console that has a gain level, something like this on the channel, that's the preamp that the signal has to go through. There's usually 2 inputs. Usually you're going to have what they call a mic input, or the balanced XLR, which is usually a mic, looks like your typical microphone balance connection. Or it's going to have the TS or TRS, which stands for tip and sleeve, or tip, ring, and sleeve type of input, which looks like the 1/4-inch jack. And they're going to be plugged into the back. Everything's going to come through that, and you're going to either, on most consoles, you're going to select either, for this console, you push it down, it sends it to line. If you leave it up, it sends it to mic. If you push it down, the signal's a lot hotter, or what they call line level. But also at the same time, if it's in line, it's usually because what's coming through the TS connection. In the TS connection is usually a hotter signal than a mic. Usually the mic is very dependent on the preamp of the console or an external preamp that you're running through it. So the preamp section, this is usually your preamp section. And on some consoles actually have a lot more control on the filtering. So it's going to route from the preamp into a filter. Like this one has a high pass filter button only. Some consoles actually have a high pass that you can turn on that actually allow you to adjust high pass and low pass connections, high pass and low pass filtering, and you can adjust that. And then next, where it routes from there, you're going to be able to route through some sort of, EQ, dynamics, and so forth. The EQ, if you turn it on, if you turn it off, it's going to go directly to the fader. But if you leave it on, it's going to go through the EQ and then to the fader. So it's the matter of you want to use EQ. That's the switch reroutes the signal to go through the EQ, and then when you turn the EQ off, it just comes from the preamp and the filter directly to the fader. Now, from there, what's going to happen is it comes to the fader, and the fader volume is then you can adjust the level of what's coming on that channel. Next, it's going to go through the pan section. The pan section lets you take that signal and send it to the left or the right. And or it's going to let you send it to both left and right if it's in the center. We call it LCR, left, center, right. Then it's going to route, it hits the mute button. And the mute button lets you mute the signal. So once it gets up to this point, you can mute it. From there, you're going to be able to route it out through with some switches such as bus selections. And that allows you to route the signal from that channel to some buses. And it also lets you route, and it connects to auxiliaries. If with the pre down and pre and post, what that does is allow you to send the signal out without anything happening to the fader when you have it on pre. If you put it on post and leave it up on post, if you bring the fader down, it cuts the signal down to the auxiliary. That's why the auxiliary is usually after the fader. But if you hit the switch, what it does is if you hit the switch, the signal will still come down to the fader, but it will also connect to a endpoint, an insert point on the signal coming from the preamp and from the EQ such as well. And you can insert the auxiliary into the signal to send it out without it coming down to the fader. You're just connecting to that. That's why it affects it the way it does. So your pre and post. If you put it on pre, it's going to allow you to be able to send it out without anything happening to the fader. But that's how the signal's routing. So the auxiliary is after that. Then from there, the same thing when you route from your channels to a bus. Your bus is still going to you're going to either be able to send it directly to your left and right to come out of the output. You're going to be able to still route it to buses, or you can steal from there. But your matrix out is connected to your buses and your left of these right here. So your signal coming from here, the matrices are only coming after the signal's been sent from your channels to the buses or your left and right. So for example, if you got a channel, let's say this channel, and you don't select any buses, here, or whatever the case may be, you select no buses. So what's going to happen is if you send none of your channels to any buses, no matter what you adjust on your matrix volume here for your group or buses, it's not going to have any signal there at all, because nothing's been sent from the channels to the buses for the matrix to hear it. So that's the reason how it routes. So if you're wondering that's the case. And also when you send, so if the signal's coming from here, and once you tap in with your auxiliary, once it comes from the preamp and through the EQ and down to the fader and then out to the auxiliaries, when you're doing from the board, when you're sending auxiliaries out from each channel, whatever channel you want to send an auxiliary out to, you're sending it from that channel to the main auxiliary output. The output then leaves out of the console and routes to whatever you have connected to those auxiliaries. And then wherever the signal is going from auxiliaries, whether it's on stage wedges or it's going to some sort of effect or compressor, the outputs of those pieces of gear, whatever case, would then return basically how you want to return it back into the console. Like some people like myself, like to take my auxiliary outputs, I like to route them to compressors, or to reverbs, some sort of reverb unit. You can return it, and these would be the stereo returns, and then the route, once it comes back into the board through the auxiliary returns, you can then route these based here. These are your routing switches. You can send it to 1 and 2 here, or 3 and 4 for your buses. These are volume levels that you can send out to auxiliaries as well. 9 and 10 for the returns. These are the main volumes, or you can sit here. You got a pre-fader, listen, and mute, and so forth. But the signal still travels into here. These are the preamps for these are the amp preamps, I guess you can say preamps for the stereo returns, which then leads the preamp to the main volumes here, and then it routes out from based on how you switch it from there. So to sum it up, I don't want to make that too confusing. So to wrap it up, in case you were wondering how the signal routes through the console, I'm using my Allen and Heath here. Some consoles are totally, their output sections are different. And there's connections on the back to do inserts and outputs, and it's just based on your mixing console. But to make it a little bit simpler, so to understand, when you put a signal, if you run it through the TS connection, it's a line level connection. If you run it through the mic connection, which is the XLR, it is a mic level, which is a lot lower signals, usually 20, 30, maybe 40 dBs less in gain. So you have to give the preamp volume level a lot more gain. This is also where you do what they call gain staging to get your levels set properly between your inputs and your faders. But it's going to come through the preamp, then it's going to route through your filter. So it comes through the input on the back and through the preamp, and then it goes to the filter. Then if you engage the EQ, it's going to route through the EQ and then come out of the EQ. Then it's going to come down to the fader. If you do not select the EQ, it's just going to leave the filter and it's going to come directly to the fader. Once it comes to the fader, it's going to come to the fader, where the fader that you have options. Then it's going to send up from the fader volume level. It's going to allow you to come through your pre-fader listen, your pan control, and then it's going to hit your mute. And then it's going to be able to go route out from there based on what you select on your buses and your auxiliary sends. So if you send here, that's why it can split off from there. It can split from the, and you can send it to your main stereo. You can send it to a bus volume level, which then it go to the main stereo. Or if you can actually send it bus out indirectly by itself, if you connect connectors for outputs on the back of the console for outputs. But most of the time you're going to send it from your fader buses to the buses, then to the main stereo out. And then from there, you can actually also send outputs from these to your matrix for outputs as well. But that's how it signals out. So, let me make sure I said that right. Once again, sum it up, comes to the preamp, select the EQ, or if your console has dynamics on it, such as compressors, gates, and stuff like an SSL, which would have compressors and gates. So it would go through the preamp of the channel. It would go through the filter controls. Then it would go through the EQ section. Then it would go through the compressor and then the compressor and the gate section. Then it would come down to the fader, which then goes to the pan, then routes through the mute. Then it would be able to route the auxiliaries, and then SSLs and consoles like that also have where you can you can have a second input on the back of the console, what allows you to do where you have a second set of faders that can also be routed to different parts of the console, such as bus channels, things like that. But once you come from here, it's going to leave the channel. It's coming to the main control room volume. Like if some consoles have a main control volume, depends on the type of console. But your main stereo, but you also can select the channels to route through bus channels, which then can go through the main output, which then comes out of the console for you to hear through the monitors. You would also have outputs, like most consoles would have direct outs connected to a recording source from the console. So that would have direct outs on each channel that would be recording into some sort of AD to DA converter. Or they would have it coming out of the bus outputs to go to an 80 to DA converter. Before interfaces and tape machines. Or before interfaces and all that. It was used to be tape machines. You know, before you had like my Antelope, you had something like 2-inch tape, or like my ADATs here. You would have that. ADATs are basically tape machines. You know, you would have tape machines, and of course there will be the controller to control the tape machine. But now that we got hard drive recording, everything goes through your 80 to D converter through your interface. That's the outputs of the console is going to that interface. But that's how the signal flows through a console, typically. Other than that, I hope I didn't confuse people too much with that. Thanks for watching. If I was a little confusing, let me know. I will try to do another video to clarify it. But that's generally how signal flows, how the routing of the signal is flowing through a console in general. Thanks for watching. Y'all have a great one.